Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy. Seem to be having some trouble with the camera on the system today, so you may not be able to see me, but it doesn't really matter. Obviously, it's the information that you're here for. So I'm just today, I'm a couple of weeks maybe late talking about this. I planned to cover it a week or two ago, but then there was just a few elements and getting people on particular days that just worked out better. But I suppose in one sense, I'm probably not too late either. Good few people have probably split fertilizer for silage this year, given the way the spring had gone, in terms of giving themselves options to potentially go back and graze it again. So there's a top up required now at this stage, and what that top up is going to be and how much it should be is probably topical enough. And in a normal year, but in a year where fertilizer is now touching off €1,200 a ton potentially for urea, it obviously makes it more significantly important again. So I'll just share a screen here with you. So Silage Fertiliser N, the question mark, I suppose, is how much is enough, and is it enough? Where's the tipping point in terms of getting a return for your investment in silage fertilizer? And obviously, at the very outset, I suppose it's important to point out to people that everybody needs to be conscious of the quantity of fertilizer or silage that they're going to require for the coming winter. And talking to some guys that are buying stock for the factories and stuff, they're telling me that there's quite a lot of cows going directly from the parlour into factories at the moment. So people are obviously making decisions around tidying up herds given the high cost year that's potentially ahead of us. And that in itself might help the silage requirement as well. And it's important to point out that there can be significant savings in both silage and, I suppose, increased availability of grass. And we would have touched on it in previous conversations over the last number of weeks by removing these cows earlier rather than later. So people actively moving on that and being proactive on that. So then the next phase of it is what silage is required. So you have to do your sums in terms of what numbers you expect to carry over the winter and what silage requirement will be required for them. And that varies from county to county, from parish to parish, potentially depending on soil types. We could be ranging anywhere from 3-month winters up to 6-month winters, depending on the location, and obviously silage requirement will change based on that. So the most important thing is that people don't skimp on actual quantity of silage that they're trying to preserve this year. But there's a fine line, and I'll show it to you in a minute, in terms of getting that balance right. Because a big pit or a load of bales of rubbish is no good to anybody. And it's important that we try to get the balance right. So I think I've a couple of charts that will really make that point quite vividly to people in a minute, okay? So just moving on, I suppose, again, we've looked at this a couple of weeks back, maybe 2 months ago now at this stage. So what cost is urea at the moment? As I said, I've heard prices of €1,200. If we were talking about €1,000 a ton a couple of weeks ago. Now, I'm led to believe that supply isn't going to be as much of a concern as it necessarily was a number of weeks ago. Definitely logistics are being troublesome at the moment in terms of getting the fertilizer maybe into the ports and maybe getting it bagged and so forth. Possibly hasn't been helped by panic buying maybe that's gone on. So I think if people are kind of cautious in terms of not looking for too much in one go, the possibility is that they might get that quicker than big loads. But I suppose the point is that at €1,200 a ton, the cost per kg is €2.61. So it's very, very significant jump in price, as you can imagine. So if we're talking about 100 kgs of nitrogen per hectare, that's €261 per hectare, or €104 an acre. So the reason I have a value of slurry in there with a question mark is that we often come across people that have outside land, and obviously more and more people are depending on outside land to provide the silage, having stocked up on the milking platform potentially. The situation with the slurry then is the slurry moving back from the main farm to that silage ground. In some cases it does, in other cases it doesn't. Where that slurry doesn't move back to the silage ground, there's potentially deficits in terms of P's and K's, or else that P and K has to be sourced in another form, in a chemical format. And as people will be aware, the P side of things is very restrictive from a nitrates regulations point of view, so that throws up its own problems. but also from a cost point of view, definitely this year, from a nitrogen point of view, the value of the slurry has increased dramatically. So getting that slurry from the home farm back to the outblocks for the silage is beneficial in terms of reducing the potential cost of the fertilization of the silage crop, but also important for feeding the crop in terms of P's and K's. However, there's a caveat to that. On the 14th of April, it's too late, in my opinion anyway, to be spreading any sort of quantity of slurry on silage ground that we will be hoping to cut in a month or 5 weeks' time, probably, because a late application of slurry is going to result in luxury uptake. Most of you will have experienced, as far as I can understand, a good day yesterday across the entire country where you could almost see grass growing. So that's going to see very rapid uptake of any K that's made available to grass, and the risk of that coming back in the silage is going to be a real potential cause of milk fever for people next spring, and we want to avoid that. So I would say, if you haven't put on the P's and K's at this stage, in terms of slurry, that you wouldn't want to be doing it you'd want to following the first cut, really, and target for, if you haven't managed to do it, that you would try to get the slurry to the silage ground in January, February or March at the latest, for the coming year. So just moving on from the cost, there's a bit of a fuzz on this graph. This is just showing the yield response to Fertilizer N on a per cut basis, with the first cut up at the top, or second cut in the red. Third cut is green here, and fourth cut. This is work that was done in Grange a number of years ago. And what we have across the bottom here, and again, apologies for the quality of the graph now, is the Fertilizer N per cut in kgs per hectare. So we've 25, 50, 75, 100, 125 and 150. So 125 kgs is the equivalent of 100 units, and 100 kgs is the equivalent of 80 units. And I suppose if we draw an imaginary line from the 100 up here to in terms of first cut, you can see that it's actually beginning to drop off probably in this area here, and that it's definitely dropping off when we get up to this area here. So in excess of 100 kgs per hectare is the return is diminishing. So I suppose we're beginning to reach that tipping point. So for me, what does this tell us? I suppose it tells us two things. It says that our old advice, or we'll say the advice of 100 units for first cut, is there or thereabouts. I suppose in a year like this, there's a question mark around the return on that last quarter of the fertilizer that's being applied. So there's still a return, but is there a return good enough for putting it on? And I think that's going to come down to the actual quantity of silage that's required, maybe by people, the area that's available to be cut. If you're tight on area, you want to try and maximize the return from the area that you're getting or that you have available. But the reality is, I suppose, at that 80 units, including slurry, it must be emphasized now, including slurry, contributing to the Fertilizer N there, we're achieving maximum return at that point, and then it's beginning to drop off while there still is a return. So I suppose what that says is, and you possibly have seen it in the media lately in relation to the kind of fodder committee that's been set up, that the recommendation from that is that people would spread at least 80 units of nitrogen for their first cut silage. So if you split application at this stage, which most people will have some fertilizer gone out, you're talking about trying to cut maybe the 20th to the 25th, anywhere from the 15th to the 25th of May. And if we work back just from, as I said, today is 14th of April, and we go to the 15th of May, that's 30 days. You wouldn't actually want to be putting out more than 60 units of nitrogen now in order to get that cut on the 15th of May. Now, if we're going to move to the 20th, obviously we have an extra couple of days, so that brings us to the 70 units. And if we're willing to go to the 25th in terms of the cut date, then we have also got the advantage of an extra 5 days there, which would allow you to put out the 80 units. The decision-making process there would probably relate to whether the ground has been grazed or not. If you're coming from a clean crop, then our clean base, obviously the scope for that crop to grow on to the 20th or 25th of May is greater. However, if it's been stopped since late last year and it hasn't hasn't been touched since and isn't going to be touched obviously at this stage, then you need to be cutting back on that nitrogen and aiming to cut maybe even on the 10th to the 15th of May in order to get a good crop of silage that's going to have quality in it. And I suppose the quality is the key thing. And as I said, I think the next one of the next graphics will show the importance of the quality. Just in relation to the actual rate of nitrogen, I suppose I was a bit taken aback a number of years ago, talking to some groups in different parts of the country at the level of nitrogen that they were using for silage, a bit on the high side, in my opinion, considering that we, as I said, we would have always recommended that 80 to 100 units. Some people seem to be going with higher rates. Just an interesting piece from that, I suppose, is that the lodging side of things, so a crop the causing of a crop to lodge, we'll say, is related to excess nitrogen usage, I suppose. And you can see here that when 120 kgs of N per hectare is applied, so that's more or less 100 units, which is a little bit over the top probably in total, that the potential for lodging is greater, and you can see that there's nearly 30%, no matter whether it's can urea, single or a split application, that the risk of lodging probably increases with the increased rate of growth. And you can see that that was on a 25th of May harvest. So if we delay the harvest further, then the risk of lodging will probably increase quite exponentially, and that'll have a dramatic effect on quality of the crop then as well. This one is the big one for me in terms of what people are going to do. You can see here that we have the impact of cutting date on total dry matter yield and total UFL production. So the total dry matter yield is the upper graph here on the top, and the bottom graph is total UFLs. So silage is going to be expensive to make this year. Talks of 150 an acre for pit silage being bandied around. Bales increasing quite significantly, as many will have seen on the journal recently on the front page. And the temptation is that let's just go for a big first cut, and we'll knock it out of the park in that sense, that we'll have a lot of silage in the yard and we'll get real good value for our 150 euros an acre that the harvester's picking up. It's actually counterintuitive, or actually foolhardy to do that, because we can see first cuts are highlighted here in blue and the second cut is highlighted in red. So we can see as our cutting date delays, going from May 29th through to the 23rd of June, which is quite extreme now, but if we say the 12th of June, which many people got caught with last year because of the weather breaking, we end up with, you can see here that we actually end up with more silage, albeit maybe not very statistically significantly different, by using two cuts that are cut early compared to a late first cut or a very late first cut. And the reason for that is that we get a very long lag phase after this kind of a first cut or this kind of a first cut. So we're getting the lodging, we're getting a very white base, and you all know and have experience of that, maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks of looking at that field sitting as a white stubble and nothing coming back in it. And the other thing is often as well, when that crop goes down, that the cut isn't very clean, so it's growing off of a very dirty base in terms of dragged when it has been mown. Whereas we're working here, we're just getting the crop to the right stage, we're taking it off, and we're very much on the move as quickly as it's has been cut. And as a result, we actually grow a greater total amount of dry matter per hectare by getting our crop off early. The knock-on effect of that then subsequently, before we even look at the UFL piece, is that we cut early here, we'll cut within 8 weeks here, and we have the opportunity then on top of this to get grazing towards the back end of the year. There could be one, there could be two, and on some dry land there could even potentially be 3. When we move to this phase, we're going to find that we're now 2 weeks later with our second cut as well, so we're nearly into August. It can be quite hard to actually get grass to grow or build maybe on that ground. So our 1 or 2 grazings can be compromised potentially by our attempt to try and get this big silage harvest. And definitely in this case, we've gone way too late. Our second cut is going to drift into August at this stage almost. And as a result, we're going to have a very low second cut, and we'll almost have little or no recovery we're talking about on that ground. And the opportunities for grazing on that ground will be limited, and it can potentially result in stock having to be housed earlier. So bear that in mind in terms of the plan, in terms of cutting date, that the earlier is actually the better. Even though you may have a smaller first cut, or you will have a smaller first cut, you will make up the balance basically in a better second cut. and it's an all-round better option to cut earlier rather than later. From a UFL point of view, obviously, digestibility decreases as the more stem that comes into the crop, and the bigger the bulk, the more the stem. And UFL obviously will drop as a result, because there's very low levels of energy in stem, as you're well aware from grazing quality grass. And the objective should be kind of something similar in terms of silage, to try and get a maximum leaf to stem ratio as possible in the silage crop in order to maximize quality. And that manifests itself in terms of UFL. And that's important given the way feed prices are going at the moment as well, because if we have a big crop of bulk here, which is low UFL, and the total quantity of UFL is low as well, we're going to have to, you can see that there's a gap potentially going to have to be filled across this area here. So if we're feeding stock this silage, we're going to have to maybe make up the difference in terms of energy intake. However, here we may be in the position where we may be able to limit the actual quantity of silage fed, because the energy content of it is high enough to suit the stock that we're feeding. Similarly, I suppose with weanlings, where we have good quality silage with good quality protein levels, we may be actually able to save a little bit in terms of feeding rates, or definitely on protein percentages being used. So that would obviously then result in cheaper ration being able to be fed over the winter period to young stock. So that's pretty much it, I suppose, in terms of what I wanted to cover today. Just to say that just need to, maybe I haven't been sharing. Sorry. So just to, I've spoken through the graphs. Basically, the maximum fertilizer tipping point is here at the kind of 80 to 100 units area there. The feed, the risk of lodging is increasing as we go with higher rates of nitrogen. And you can see here then that this is what I've spent the last few minutes talking about, which you haven't been able to see. So the first cut, two good cuts rather than one big cut and a moderate or poor second cut, is really the important point that has to be made here. And that earlier cut is facilitating a greater dry matter production in total from the whole area that's under silage, and then potentially for grazing subsequently, compared to one big cut, which has a dramatic impact in terms of the second cut because of that long lag phase. And then that feeds through to the energy content as well. So high bulk equals low energy. And if we have to supplement and fill that gap for 2022 winter, then it's going to be an expensive situation for people trying to do that. So that's apologies to people for the fact that I wasn't sharing the screen there. As I said, I'm actually not in my own office today, and my connection doesn't seem to be as good, so apologies. So hopefully that makes sense. So I'll just go back and go full screen there and just run through them again. So that was just a piece in the value of the fertilizer, and the value of the slurry in terms of reducing the cost of the nitrogen associated with it. Our tipping point is here at our 80 to 100 units, and the advice would be that there'd be a minimum of 80 units applied for silage. But bear in mind that if we haven't grazed that ground since late last year, then putting on 80 units at this stage is now going to push your cutting date quite late for that kind of ground, and you would be better off cutting that early, going back, topping up for a second cut, and you should get a good strong second cut from that as well. And then that would obviously facilitate grazing then as well. Ground that's grazed this spring obviously has the potential to push that first cut date a bit later, but at the same time we still think that people should be probably targeting to cut within the 10th to the 30th of May type window, maybe drifting into the early days of June with stuff that has been grazed relatively late, because obviously quality will be maintained where it has been grazed. So this, for me, as I said, is the real key slide and the whole thing in relation to silage. Temptation there, because of the cost this year, that we'll drive up, we'll go for this big cut here, but actually it's going to be a negative. So don't be tempted to fall into that trap. You still get, in terms of energy value, you're going to get good value from whatever you're paying your contractor by getting two good cuts, rather than trying to drive, making burn diesel to put a big crop through in first cut, and all you'll have is a big heap of strong stemmy grass that you will end up supplementing during the winter to try to get stock to be right. And again, it might sound mad to say it, but you'd be better off to be trying to limit silage. And okay, it's not the easiest thing to do, but you'd be better off to be trying to limit intake of good quality silage rather than trying to step up or boost up a poor quality silage, because there's a double whammy. Poor quality silage, it has lower intake in itself as well, because it's a high capacity, so its gut fill is higher with it because of the stem ratio in it, so they can't eat enough of it to kind of look after themselves. Particularly important for the young stock, as cows tend to have an ability to survive away. However, we do want condition to, like, we are depending on silage to put on condition on cows more and more since quotas went, because the opportunity is there to milk on later. So when they do go onto a dry cow diet, they often need to be pushed on a little bit in order to make sure that they'll achieve the right body condition score at calving. If we're in a good position in terms of calving condition score, we can limit this a little bit, and I would definitely prefer to be in the situation where I'm limiting a high quality feed rather than trying to supplement a poor quality feed. So apologies for the failing to share there properly throughout the course of that there this morning. I hope you got some value from it. As I said, no more than 80 units or a minimum of 80 units, but a maximum of 100 at the very top level in terms of what's applied. And that's including the slurry. It's very important to emphasize including the slurry. And if you are using dribble bar, you have to factor in that each 1,000 gallons that you've applied is contributing 3 units more than you would actually have had in the past, which if you were using a splash plate. So if you have applied 3,000 gallons, for simplicity, we'll say, instead of having 18 units, you now have 27 units. So that actually facilitates you cutting back quite significantly on your fertilizer, and the saving can be made there rather than saving on not actually fertilizing the crop properly, if you understand. Furthermore, I suppose the amount that goes on now is important, and watch that cutting date. So it could actually vary, and while it is an awkward scenario, opening pits and closing pits, you'd be better off to actually operate on that kind of a system rather than to work the system of trying to get it all in one go. So it might mean multiple cuts. I suppose think about the way you're covering your pit to make it easy to open it again, to put it in. Been on a couple of farms where they just use the netting to cover the pits and the bags of stone, and it's very easy to strip the pit and put in more as opposed to tire on tire. But it's important that pit is well covered and that it's well sealed, obviously, as well, every time that it is closed up. So just be conscious of that as well. Just one question in as well: if you're using the dribble bar for slurry, could you still put it on silage ground? The answer to that is, I suppose, dependent on the grass situation on that ground. If it's just been recently grazed, in order to try to get yourself out of the corner with grass availability for cows or whatever, then the reality is, I suppose, you could put it onto clean stubble, because your cutting date is probably going to be that little bit later, going towards the end of May and into early June potentially. But I'd like it to be watery, and I wouldn't like it to be a lot. So I think 1,500 gallons maybe at most, probably at this stage. I think it's just the risk of K coming back in the silage is something that's a real problem for people. I think we didn't see as much of it this year because our silage cuts were delayed quite significantly because of bad weather. But then we ended up with the fact that we had poor quality silage, maybe as can be seen maybe by milk deliveries are a little bit back this year, even though cow numbers are kind of similar. So hopefully you got something from that today. Thanks for your interactions, and again, apologies for the screen sharing there and throughout the earlier part of the presentation. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Emma Louise Coffey, who's going to talk about the farm managers course, and I suppose just a couple of elements, I suppose, in terms of people coming onto farms and the labour that work on farms, or the people that work on farms, sorry, and how people expect to be treated, how they should be treated, and what the course can do for people as well. So it's maybe interesting for some people that maybe have young people coming through that are interested in farming. It's not necessarily a course that you have to do just to become a farm manager for someone else. It's well worth doing if people are considering farming in their own right on their home farm. So tune in next week for Emma Louise. And we'll also have one of the former students on with us as well to give his experience of it as well. So look forward to talking to you then. In the meantime, have a good week. And for any of you that are in the Moore Park area, there's an excellent farm walk on today at Michael Gowan's, just outside of Moore Park, in relation to the clover. And for anyone in the Macroom area, there'll be an equally excellent one in relation to clover on the farm of Jimmy Cotter. So if you're in that area, drop by there at 11 o'clock for both of those walks. And I'm sure there's other walks going on across the country that I'm just not aware of at the moment as well. So talk to you next week. Have a nice Easter, everyone, and take care.